Hello, my name is Landon Remington, 38 years old. I currently live in Seattle, a rainy and vibrant city where I am the co-founder of a growing tech startup. These days, I often sit in my small office, looking out at the rain-glistened streets, feeling a fresh breeze in my life. But to tell you how I got here, I have to take you back to the past, to the days when I was the eldest son of the wealthy Remington family, living under the heavy shadow of my father, Douglas Remington, and a legacy that I never truly felt was mine. I grew up in Connecticut, in a sprawling mansion with marble hallways and expensive paintings hanging on the walls. My family owned Remington Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar real estate and financial investment conglomerate built by my father from his younger years. As the eldest son, I was raised with the expectation that I would take over that empire. But for me, expectations weren't motivation. They were like a rope tightening around my neck every day. My father, Douglas, was a stern man with eyes like razors and a voice that could silence an entire boardroom. He didn't just want success, he wanted everyone to know he was successful. Every word he spoke carried the weight of authority, and from a young age I learned never to talk back. "Landon, you need to be sharper," he would often say, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the ebony dining table, his eyes never leaving me. "You're a Remington. Don't let me down." But no matter how hard I tried, graduating from an Ivy League school, working myself to exhaustion as the company's director of business development, I never heard a word of praise from him. Only headshakes, sharp criticisms, and the feeling that I was always missing something. My mother, Rosemary, was a gentlewoman, but her gentleness was fragile, like glass. She loved me, I knew that, but her love was always restrained by her fear of my father. "Landon, you have to be patient," she would whisper when I was frustrated, her trembling hand grasping mine. "Your father only wants the best." But to me, her version of the best felt like a gilded cage, beautiful but suffocating. Then there was Bryce, my younger brother, 7 years my junior. Bryce was the light of the family with a bright smile and a charm that won everyone over. He was spoiled from a young age, allowed to fail without consequence. While I was pressured to be perfect, Bryce could stumble and still be coddled by our parents. "He's still young, Landon," my father would say whenever I complained. "You're the eldest. You have to set an example." But setting an example for me often meant silently enduring, shouldering expectations that Bryce never had to face. I remember one evening when I was 27, having spent months preparing a plan to expand the company's market into Europe. I stood before the board, my heart pounding, hoping this time my father would look at me differently. But when I finished my presentation, he just sat there, tapping his pen on the table, and said, "You think these ideas are impressive enough, Landon? We don't need half-baked efforts." The boardroom fell silent. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I only nodded, swallowing my humiliation and walking out. It wasn't the first time nor the last. Each time a piece of me seemed to shatter. The conflicts in my family never erupted into loud arguments. They were like an undercurrent, cold, constant, and ever-present. But on that Thanksgiving evening, that undercurrent surged, breaking everything apart. I vividly remember the biting cold of November in Connecticut, the wind whistling through, sending golden leaves fluttering outside the windows. Our mansion was lavishly decorated with the glow of crystal chandeliers casting shimmering light across the long dining table. Thanksgiving dinner wasn't just a family occasion, it was an event. Relatives from across the country gathered, joined by a few major shareholders of Remington Enterprises and distinguished guests my father invited to flaunt his power. I sat near the head of the table opposite Bryce, with my mother beside me and my father at the head, presiding like a king in his own court. The atmosphere was initially pleasant, at least by Remington standards. Small talk mingled with the clink of cutlery against porcelain plates. I stayed quiet as usual, nodding when someone asked about work or made a polite remark. But I noticed my father's eyes, sharp, calculating, darting toward me more than usual. A sense of unease crept over me like a storm brewing on the horizon. And then it hit, swift and merciless. As dessert was served, fragrant pumpkin pie and shimmering red wine, my father stood raising his glass, commanding every eye in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice deep and authoritative, "I'd like to take this opportunity to share some good news about the future of the Remington family and our company." Smiles spread, curiosity piqued. I gripped my wine glass tightly, sensing something was wrong. "Landon, my son," he continued, his gaze locking onto me, "will soon be engaged to Eleanor Caldwell, the daughter of the state governor. This is not just a family union, but a strategic step to ensure our billion-dollar complex project is approved, a perfect move for Remington Enterprises." The room erupted in applause and congratulations. But for me, it felt like the blood in my veins had stopped flowing. Eleanor Caldwell? I'd met her exactly once at a charity event, and we barely exchanged 3 sentences. This wasn't a proposal. It was a command, a political marriage arranged to serve my father's interests, with me as nothing more than a pawn. I glanced at my mother. Her head was bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, avoiding my gaze. Bryce smirked as if suppressing a laugh. The guests? They watched me with curious eyes, waiting for my reaction. My heart pounded, and for the first time in my life I felt a fire ignite in my chest. Not fear, but rage. "No," I said, my voice clear, though trembling slightly. The room fell silent. My father's brow furrowed, his wine glass pausing midair. "I won't marry Eleanor Caldwell. I don't agree to this marriage." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. I heard someone gasp, probably Aunt Margaret. My mother looked up, her eyes wide with panic. Bryce whispered something to the person beside him, his eyes gleaming as if watching a play unfold. But my father, he didn't blink. He just stared at me, and I could see the fury boiling in his eyes. "What did you say, Landon?" His voice was low, dangerous, like the growl of a beast before it strikes. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I said I won't marry her. I'm not a tool for you to use in your plans." The room held its breath. Then my father laughed, a dry, humorless laugh. "You dare speak to me like that, Landon? An ungrateful wretch, the greatest disappointment of this family, daring to reject the opportunity I've given you?" He stepped toward me, each footfall thudding against the wooden floor, echoing in the silence. "Who do you think you are? You're nothing without me, without Remington Enterprises." I wanted to retort, to say I'd done everything he ever asked of me for years, but the words caught in my throat. And then, before I could react, my father raised his glass of red wine and flung it straight at my face. The cold liquid splashed across my forehead, dripping down my cheeks, soaking into my white shirt. The sharp smell of wine filled my nostrils. I heard my mother's faint gasp, someone's stifled chuckle, and the murmurs of the guests. "You don't deserve the Remington name," my father snarled, slamming the glass onto the table, the sound of shattering crystal ringing like a verdict. "Get out. Now!" I stood, my hands trembling, my blood boiling. Wine dripped onto the floor like my own blood spilling. No one spoke. No one stood up for me. My mother kept her head down. Bryce smirked, and the others just watched, as if I were a stranger who had ruined their party. I left the room, my footsteps heavy in the long hallway. When I reached my apartment, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "Landon, you should reconsider. Your father only wants the best." And right after, one from Bryce. "You're such an idiot, Landon. Defying Dad? You'll regret this." I stood there in my dark apartment, humiliation and anger swirling together like a wave threatening to drown me. The apartment I called home sat on a quiet street in Connecticut, not far from the family mansion. It wasn't as lavish as my parents' home, but it was my own space, or so I had thought. I sank onto the sofa, still wearing the wine-stained shirt, the acrid smell clinging to me like a reminder of the humiliation that had just unfolded. My mind was reeling. For the first time in my 35 years, I had dared to stand up to my father. But that fleeting sense of freedom was quickly overtaken by fear. My father was not a man who forgave easily, and I knew he wouldn't let this slide. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't check it. I didn't want to read more of my mother's placating advice or Bryce's mocking taunts. I just wanted a moment of silence to process what had happened. But silence was never something the Remington family granted. The next morning, I was jolted awake by incessant knocking at the door. Still groggy, I opened it to find a man in a suit standing there holding a stack of documents. "Mr. Landon Remington?" he asked, his voice flat. I nodded, a sinking feeling rising in my gut. "I'm a representative from the legal office of Remington Enterprises. I've been instructed to inform you that your employment contract has been terminated, effective immediately." He handed me a thick envelope, his eyes devoid of emotion. "Additionally, this apartment is company property. You have 24 hours to vacate." I stood frozen as if I'd been slapped. "What? This is my home," I nearly shouted, but the man only shrugged. "All assets you've been using, the apartment, the car, the company credit cards, are registered under Remington Enterprises. This decision comes directly from Mr. Douglas Remington." He turned and left, leaving me with the envelope in my hands and an indescribable emptiness. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was the official termination letter, along with a notice that my primary bank account, where my salary and bonuses from the company were deposited, had been frozen. I checked my personal savings account, the one I kept separate. A few $100,000 remained, a significant sum to many, but to me it felt like a drop in the desert. I had lived my entire life in the opulence of the Remington world, and now I had almost nothing. By noon, someone came to repossess the Bentley I drove. "Company orders," one of them said, avoiding my gaze. I stood there, watching the car disappear down the street, feeling like a piece of my identity went with it. I returned to the apartment and began packing the few things that truly belonged to me. A handful of clothes, an old laptop, and a notebook where I'd once jotted down business ideas my father never bothered to look at. That night, I sat among the boxes, my phone buzzing incessantly. A message from my mother. "Landon, you've hurt your father. Apologize, and this can be fixed." I gave a bitter laugh. Fixed? No, she didn't understand. To my father, this wasn't about hurt. It was about punishment. Another message from Bryce. "Congrats, big brother, you're free now. But what kind of freedom is it when you've got nothing left, right?" I turned off the phone and tossed it onto the couch. Bryce's words cut like a knife, but I was too drained to be angry anymore. I looked around the apartment one last time. Bare walls, furniture that wasn't mine. I'd lived here for nearly a decade, but now I realized it had never truly been home. It was just another part of the stage my father had set, and I'd just been kicked off it. The next morning, I called a taxi carrying 2 suitcases and a duffel bag. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in Connecticut. Every street, every corner bore the shadow of the Remington family and of my failures. As the taxi pulled away, I looked out the window, watching the sunlight glint off the increasingly bare trees. I didn't cry, but my chest ached, as if someone were squeezing my heart. I told the driver to take me to the airport. When he asked, "Where to, sir?" I hesitated. "Seattle," I replied almost instinctively. I'd read about the city, where tech startups sprouted like mushrooms, where young, passionate people were changing the world. I didn't know what awaited me, but I knew one thing. I didn't want to be the Landon Remington of yesterday anymore. As the plane took off, I looked down at Connecticut one last time, feeling like I was leaving behind not just a place, but a person. I was no longer the eldest son of the Remington family. I was just Landon, and for the first time in my life, I had to figure out who that was. Seattle greeted me with a drizzle, the damp cold seeping through my thin coat. I dragged my suitcase through the airport, feeling adrift among the bustling crowd. In my pocket was the last of my money, a few $100,000, the remnants of my years toiling for Remington Enterprises. It was enough to survive for a while, but not enough to live as I once had. No more luxurious apartments, no cars, no extravagant dinners. It was just me and for the first time that was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I rented a small apartment in Capitol Hill, a cramped space with creaky wooden floors and peeling paint. It smelled of mildew, but the window overlooked a lively street where young people in hoodies and canvas bags passed by, laughing and chatting. I stood there watching them, wondering if I could become part of this world, a world unbound by the Remington name. Those first days in Seattle were a series of challenges. I'd never had to fend for myself. In Connecticut, I had assistants, drivers, and an entire team ready to follow my orders. Now I had to learn how to cook, do laundry, and budget every penny to make it through the month. I remember one evening when I tried to make a simple spaghetti dish and ended up burning the pan. Sitting in my tiny kitchen, smoke billowing around me, I laughed, not out of joy, but at the irony. Landon Remington, who once orchestrated million-dollar deals, couldn't even cook a meal. But then I found the first glimmer of light in the darkness. One afternoon, while sitting in a small coffee shop, where I often went to use the free Wi-Fi, I overheard a group of young people discussing their startup project. They were at the table next to me, passionately debating an app that connected local farmers with consumers. Their idea was rough, but their eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. I listened, feeling something stir inside me. I'd once dreamed of bold ideas like theirs, but my father always dismissed them as fanciful. Summoning my courage, I approached their table. "Excuse me," I said, my voice slightly hesitant. "I overheard you talking about your project. I've worked in business and marketing. If you need help, I'm willing to pitch in." They looked at me, a 34-year-old man in a worn sweater, with skepticism. But then the group's leader, Mia, smiled. "All right, if you're up for working with a bunch of fresh-out-of-college kids, let's see what you've got." She handed me a coffee, and just like that, I stepped into their world. The startup consisted of 4 people: Mia, a passionate software engineer; Jay, a disheveled programmer; Sarah, a UI designer; and Ethan, the overly optimistic finance guy. They worked out of a tiny rented room on the outskirts of town, with rickety furniture and a whiteboard covered in scribbled notes. I poured my savings into the project, not because I was certain it would succeed, but because I wanted to believe in something, in them and in myself. The first few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless days. I never imagined starting over could be so hard. At Remington Enterprises, I had support teams, abundant resources, and everything neatly organized. Here, in the startup's cramped room, everything was chaos. Jay's computer crashed constantly, Sarah argued endlessly over app interface colors, and Ethan's relentless optimism, "We're almost there," persisted even when the company account dwindled to a few $1,000s. Mia, with her boundless energy, kept things from falling apart, but even she had moments of doubt. I handled communications and marketing, a role I thought I'd excel at given my experience at Remington Enterprises. But reality was harsher. The strategies I'd used for big deals didn't work for a small startup with a tight budget. I had to learn to write social media posts, pitch to local journalists, and even shoot promotional videos on my phone. Once, I stood in front of my apartment mirror, rehearsing a product pitch, only to realize my voice sounded stiff and distant, as if I were still trying to play Landon Remington, Director of Business Development, instead of Landon, the man trying to find his way in a new world. Living frugally was a brutal lesson. I was used to 5-star restaurant meals. Now I calculated how to buy discounted groceries. Some nights, lying on my creaky bed, listening to the rain tap against the window, I wondered if I'd made a mistake leaving Connecticut. Memories of that Thanksgiving dinner haunted me. The red wine dripping down my face, my father's cold laugh, my mother's silent gaze. But whenever I thought about going back, apologizing to my father, and returning to my old life, a small flame sparked inside me. No, I told myself, I couldn't go back to being his puppet. One evening, as the team worked late in the office, Mia pulled me aside. "Landon, you okay?" she asked, her sharp but caring eyes studying me. I started to say I was fine, as always, but stopped. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hoarse. I used to think I knew who I was, but now, I'm not sure. Mia nodded as if she understood. No one knows everything, she said. But you're here, trying. That's what matters. Her words were like a small beacon in the dark. I began to realize that despite the hardships, I was living my own life, not my father's. But the road ahead was still uncertain, and I knew the biggest challenges were yet to come. In Seattle, I was struggling to find my footing. But thousands of miles away in Connecticut, my younger brother Bryce was being thrust into the very cage I had rejected. A forced marriage, a performance orchestrated by our father. I had cut off contact with my family since leaving Connecticut. I changed my phone number and deliberately avoided any news about Remington Enterprises. I didn't want to know what my father was doing or whether my mother was still sending anxious messages. But in quiet moments, I thought about Bryce. He had always been the pampered younger brother, shielded by our parents, always escaping trouble with his dazzling smile. I wondered, was he enjoying the life I'd left behind? Or was he too feeling that cage tightening around him? The truth came to me through a chance article online, stumbled upon while scrolling through headlines as I waited for my coffee at the usual cafe. Youngest Remington son engaged to governor's daughter, the headline read, accompanied by a photo of Bryce and Eleanor Caldwell standing together at a charity event. Bryce looked dashing in a suit, his smile as perfect as ever, but his eyes were empty, as if that smile was just a mask. Eleanor, beautiful and poised, held his hand, but something about their posture, stiff, distant, made me uneasy. I read the article, each word piercing my chest. After I refused the marriage to Eleanor, my father had swiftly shifted his focus to Bryce. A perfect alliance between two powerful families, the article declared, describing the marriage as a strategic move to solidify Remington Enterprises' position in the billion-dollar complex project. I could picture my father with his razor-sharp gaze persuading, or rather commanding, Bryce to comply. "You're a Remington," I imagined him saying. "This is your duty." I knew Bryce had no choice. Unlike me, he didn't have the courage or perhaps the recklessness to defy our father. Bryce had always been sheltered, taught that following our father's orders was the easiest path. But I also knew from the look in his eyes in that photo that he wasn't happy. His married life, according to the article, was a parade of public events, parties, interviews, and model family photos splashed across the press. But beneath it all, I sensed the suffocation. Bryce, who once flitted through life with carefree ease, was now bound in a performance directed by our father, with Eleanor and the Caldwell family as his co-stars. I sat in the cafe, my coffee growing cold in my hands, my heart heavy. I didn't blame Bryce for agreeing. He was only doing what he'd been taught his whole life: obey. But I couldn't help thinking about what he was going through, waking up each morning next to a stranger, forcing smiles for the cameras, and feeling controlled by both his family and the Caldwells. I knew that feeling because I had lived in that cage, albeit in a different way. I wondered if Bryce ever thought of me or if he regretted mocking me that Thanksgiving night. But regardless, I couldn't do anything for him from Seattle. I could only keep forging my own path, hoping that one day Bryce would find the courage I had found, or at the very least that I could help him when the time came. In Seattle, I threw myself into the startup as a way to escape my past. The early days of struggle gradually gave way to a new rhythm. Mia, Jay, Sarah, Ethan, and I worked like maniacs, pouring our hearts into an app connecting farmers with consumers. We called it GreenLink, a simple yet promising idea that let city dwellers buy fresh produce directly from local farms. But turning that idea into reality was a battle. We faced endless issues: software bugs, funding shortages, and heated debates over direction. Some nights, lying on my creaky bed in the apartment, I wondered if I was betting everything on an unrealistic dream. But after 3 grueling years, a breakthrough came. One morning, Mia burst into the office, eyes blazing, holding up her phone like a trophy. "Landon, you won't believe this," she shouted. A TechCrunch article had just named Greenlink a startup to watch in the agri-tech space. The piece praised our idea, calling it a groundbreaking solution for sustainable food. I read the article over and over, my heart pounding. For the first time, I felt I'd truly accomplished something, not to please my father, but for myself and the team. That article was like a pebble creating ripples. Investors started to take notice. A venture capital firm from Silicon Valley reached out requesting a meeting. I remember that meeting in a sleek San Francisco office, standing before men and women in expensive suits pitching Greenlink. This time, there were no scornful glares from my father, no cold criticisms. They listened, nodded, and finally one said, "We want to invest. $10 million to scale up." I could hardly believe my ears. As we shook hands, Mia squeezed my hand under the table, her smile radiant. Within 6 months, Greenlink exploded. We expanded the team, moved to a larger office in downtown Seattle, and our app was everywhere. More investors poured in, and by year's end, Greenlink was valued at over $100 million. I, the man my father once called a disappointment, was now invited to speak at major tech conferences. I stood on stages before hundreds, sharing Greenlink's journey. But deep down, I knew I was telling my own story. A story of someone who dared to step out from his family's shadow. In those days, I began to realize that success wasn't just about money in the bank or glowing articles. It was the feeling of freedom, of living as the person I wanted to be. But even in that glow, I couldn't stop thinking about Bryce, about Connecticut, and what I'd left behind. I wondered if he knew about me, about what I'd achieved. And I wondered if one day I could help him break free from the cage our father had built for both of us. Seattle had become my home, not because of its rain-soaked streets or my small Capitol Hill apartment, but because of Greenlink, the brainchild of my team and me. After 3 years of struggle, our company was now a name in tech magazines with investments pouring in like water. I stood on conference stages talking about how Greenlink connected farmers with consumers, but deep down, I carried an emptiness, a void shaped by family, by Bryce. I had tried to lock away the past, but it crept into quiet moments when I sat alone in my office, watching the rain fall outside. One April evening, as I celebrated with the team at a small bar near the office after a successful funding round, something unexpected happened. I was laughing with Mia, a beer in hand, when the door swung open. A familiar figure stepped in, tall, lean, with neatly styled blonde hair but eyes heavy with exhaustion, far from the sparkle I once knew. Bryce, my younger brother, standing there in a Seattle bar, thousands of miles from Connecticut. I nearly dropped my beer, my heart pounding as if it might leap out of my chest. "Landon?" Bryce called, his voice hoarse, as if unsure I was really there. I stood, my legs heavy, and for a moment we just stared at each other like strangers who were once brothers. "Bryce?" I said, my voice catching. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over me, lingering on my worn hoodie and scuffed sneakers. "You look different," he said, a faint smile flickering. I gave a wry laugh, gesturing to the table where the Greenlink team sat. "Sit down. Tell me what's going on." We settled into a quiet corner of the bar where the hum of the crowd and faint jazz music couldn't drown out the tension between us. Bryce no longer looked like the confident kid I knew. His suit was still expensive, but his shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. I ordered 2 beers, sliding one toward him, and waited. I knew Bryce hadn't flown across the country just to visit. Something was wrong. "I don't know where to start," Bryce said, his fingers tracing the rim of the untouched beer. Everything's falling apart, Landon." His voice trembled, and I saw desperation in his eyes, something I'd never seen in Bryce, the sheltered brother always shielded from our father's storms. He told me about his marriage to Eleanor Caldwell. After I rejected the political marriage our father had arranged, Bryce had been thrust into the role, a substitute pawn. "Dad said it was my chance to prove I was a true Remington," he said, his voice bitter. "But you know what? It wasn't a chance. It was a trap. Bryce described a life of control. Eleanor, though intelligent and charming in public, was distant, living by the Caldwell's script. Every move Bryce made, from dinner parties to speeches, was meticulously planned. "I feel like a puppet," he said, his hands clenching until his knuckles whitened. "Every day I have to perform. I don't know who I am anymore." I sat there, listening, feeling like I was looking at an old version of myself, the one trapped in our father's cage. I wanted to say something to comfort him, but the words stuck in my throat. Bryce looked at me, his eyes full of pain. "You did it, Landon. You got out and built something. Me, I don't know how to escape." I took a deep breath, searching for words. "Bryce, I didn't leave because I was stronger than you," I said, my voice low. "I left because I had nothing left to lose, but you can still choose." He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "Choose? If I say no, Dad will do to me what he did to you. Take everything. I don't have your courage, Landon." I wanted to tell him that courage wasn't something you were born with. It was forged through pain, sleepless nights, and self-doubt. But before I could speak, Bryce stood, mumbling an apology. "I just wanted to see you," he said. "I heard about Greenlink. I'm proud of you, even if I never said it." He turned and walked out of the bar, leaving me with an unfinished beer and a sense of helplessness. I sat there in the dim light of the bar, thinking about Bryce and the paths we'd taken. I had found freedom, but at the cost of distance from my family. Bryce was still trapped, and for the first time I felt not anger but responsibility. I wanted to help him, but I didn't know how. The brief encounter with Bryce at the Seattle bar left me with a lingering sense of unease. He left quickly, as if afraid of being spotted, but his desperate eyes and words, "I feel like a puppet," echoed in my mind. I knew Bryce was living in a cage, just as I once had. But I never imagined that just a few months later he would make a decision that would shake the entire Remington family. In Seattle, I carried on with Greenlink. The company was now a shining star in the tech startup world. We had just signed a major deal with a supermarket chain to distribute local farm produce through our app. Late-night meetings, conference speeches, and investor calls kept me so busy I barely had time to think about Connecticut. But every time my phone buzzed with an unknown number, my heart raced, hoping it was Bryce, and dreading it might be bad news. Then one morning, as I was checking emails in the office, a message came from an unfamiliar number. "Landon, it's me. I did it. I filed for divorce." I froze, rereading the text, the world around me going silent. Bryce, my little brother, who had been too afraid to defy our father, who had accepted the marriage to Eleanor Caldwell to please the family, had filed for divorce. I called him immediately, no hesitation. "Landon," Bryce's voice came through, faint but carrying a resolve I'd never heard before. "I couldn't keep going. I couldn't live like that anymore." He explained that after our meeting in Seattle, he'd done a lot of thinking. "You were right," he said. "I can choose. And I'm choosing not to live as a puppet anymore." I sank into my chair, gripping the phone, feeling both proud and worried. "Have you told Eleanor?" I asked. Bryce paused, then replied, "She knows." She wasn't surprised, but her family, they're furious. I could imagine the Caldwell's rage. To them, Bryce and Eleanor's marriage wasn't just a family union. It was a political contract, a way to bolster Governor Caldwell's power and secure benefits for Remington Enterprises. Bryce's divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was an act of betrayal in their eyes. "What about Dad?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Dad, he called me ungrateful. Said I've destroyed everything he built," Bryce said, his voice catching. "But this time, I'm not apologizing. I'm not going back." A mix of emotions surged within me. I was proud that Bryce had finally found his courage, but I also knew the price he'd pay wouldn't be small. I remembered the day I left Connecticut when our father stripped me of everything, my apartment, car, bank account. Bryce was now facing the same risk, perhaps worse because he wasn't just defying our father but also the Caldwells. "Where are you?" I asked. "What do you need?" Bryce gave a dry laugh, a mix of exhaustion and relief. "I'm in New York for now. I don't know what I'm doing next, but I want to see you. I need you." His words choked me up. Growing up, we had never been truly close. I was the eldest, burdened with the pressure to be perfect, while Bryce was the pampered younger brother, always forgiven. But now, at this crossroads in our lives, I felt a new connection. Not as Remington brothers, but as two people trying to escape our father's shadow. I arranged to fly to New York that weekend. When I met Bryce at a small Brooklyn cafe, he looked like a different version of himself. The expensive suit had been replaced by a simple shirt and jeans, his blonde hair no longer meticulously styled but left loose. What struck me most was his eyes, no longer empty as they were in Seattle, but lit with a flicker of hope, though still tinged with fear. "I did the right thing, didn't I?" Bryce asked, fidgeting with his coffee cup, seeking reassurance. "You did what you needed to do," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But it won't be easy, Bryce. Dad won't forgive you, and the Caldwells, they'll do everything to retaliate." Bryce nodded, his lips pressed tight. "I know. They've already cut all ties with Dad's company. The billion-dollar project he bet everything on, it's falling apart." I wasn't surprised, but a chill ran through me. Our father, Douglas Remington, who prided himself on absolute control, was now facing the consequences of his own schemes. Bryce shared more details. After filing for divorce, he faced a storm. Eleanor, though she didn't love him, was humiliated by the public fallout. The Caldwells declared Bryce's actions a betrayal not just to them but to the shared interests of both families. They withdrew all political support from Remington Enterprises, leaving the billion-dollar complex project, our father's obsession, in limbo. Partners began pulling out, and the press started reporting on the collapse of the Remington empire. Bryce, once our father's golden son, was now branded a wrecker. Listening to Bryce, I couldn't help but recall that Thanksgiving night when our father threw red wine in my face in front of everyone. I knew the sting of being stripped of identity, of being seen as a failure by the man who had once been the center of my world. But looking at Bryce, I saw something else, a spark of liberation. He was scared, yes, but he was also free, even if just beginning to be. "What's your plan?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Bryce shook his head. "I don't know. I just know I can't go back. But I've got nothing, Landon. Dad cut me off. Bank accounts, car, apartment. I've got a few $1,000s and a suitcase of clothes." I smiled, though my heart ached. "Sound familiar?" I said. And for the first time that meeting, Bryce laughed, a small, genuine laugh. I invited Bryce to Seattle, offering him a place in my apartment until he found his way. "I'm not saying it'll be easy," I said, "but I promise you won't be alone." Bryce looked at me, his eyes glistening, and for a moment I saw the little brother who used to chase me around the Connecticut estate's garden begging to play ball. "Thanks, Landon," he said, his voice hoarse. "I never said this, but I'm sorry. For that night, for what I said." I nodded, no words needed. Bryce's apology didn't erase the past, but it opened a new door between us. I knew his road ahead would be thorny just as mine had been. But this time, he wasn't alone. And I, though still carrying scars from our family, felt a quiet relief knowing I could be the brother Bryce needed. As we left the cafe, New York was raining, a light drizzle like Seattle's. Bryce pulled up his hoodie and I saw him walk with a hint of resolve, though still tentative. I wondered if this was the start of a new Bryce or just a moment before he'd be pulled back into the storm. But either way, I decided I'd be there. Not to save him, but to face what was coming alongside him. One morning, as I was reviewing revenue reports in the office, Mia walked in, holding her phone with a strange expression. "Landon, have you seen this?" she asked, handing me the device. A Bloomberg article appeared on the screen, headlined, "Remington Enterprises faces crisis, billion-dollar project stalls after alliance collapses." I skimmed it, my heart racing. The article detailed how the Caldwell family, following Bryce's divorce from Eleanor, had completely withdrawn political support for the complex project my father had staked everything on. Partners pulled funding, loans were tightened, and Remington Enterprises' stock plummeted. The company, once a symbol of power and invincibility, now teetered on the brink. I sank into my chair, feeling as if I'd been yanked back to Connecticut, to the marble hallways of the family mansion where my father once ruled with an iron hand. Douglas Remington, who controlled every facet of life, mine, Bryce's, our mother's, was now losing what he valued most, his empire. Part of me felt a cold satisfaction, a grim pleasure at the thought of him backed into a corner. But a deeper part, buried within, ached with a dull pain. Despite leaving the family, despite the humiliation he inflicted on me that Thanksgiving night, he was still my father. And Remington Enterprises, though I despised it, was part of my memories. I called Bryce that afternoon. He was staying at my Seattle apartment, sleeping on the sofa and trying to find work. "Have you seen the article?" I asked. Bryce sighed over the phone. "Yeah, Dad called me this morning. He blamed me, Landon. Called me the destroyer of the family legacy." His voice wavered, but I detected a new resolve. "But I don't regret it. Not anymore." I fell silent, picturing our father in his Connecticut office behind his ebony desk, his sharp gaze perhaps now masking panic. I used to fear those eyes, lived my whole life trying to please them. But hearing Bryce, I realized our father was no longer the invincible man I once knew. He had bet everything on the Caldwell alliance, and when Bryce broke it, he lost his strongest card. In the weeks that followed, news about Remington Enterprises grew bleaker. Competitors swooped in, snatching contracts my father once held secure. Investors fled, and the press began calling it the fall of an empire. Once I saw a photo of my father in an online article. He was at a press conference, looking a decade older with deeper wrinkles and weary eyes. My mother, standing beside him, wore her forced smile, but I knew she was breaking inside. I wanted to call her, to ask if she was okay, but I couldn't. Not out of anger, but because I feared her voice would pull me back into the cage I'd escaped. Bryce, meanwhile, was slowly finding himself in Seattle. He started freelancing, writing content for small tech companies, and I saw him smile more. One evening, as we ate pizza in my apartment, he said, "You know, for the first time I feel like I'm living, not performing." I smiled, but my heart was heavy. Bryce's freedom, like mine, had come at a cost. The collapse of Remington Enterprises. That is the story of my life. From the eldest son living in the suffocating shadow of the Remington family to a man who found freedom in Seattle's rain. I once thought I had to carry the world, my father's expectations, the family legacy, and the Remington name like an iron crown. But now, sitting in my small apartment, listening to the rain tap steadily on the window and watching Bryce sleep soundly on the sofa, I realize my true world isn't in skyscrapers or million-dollar deals. It's here, in these simple moments, in the freedom Bryce and I paid dearly to claim. My journey is no fairy tale. Leaving Connecticut, I lost everything. My apartment, car, bank account, and the sense of belonging somewhere. That Thanksgiving night when my father threw red wine in my face and called me ungrateful, I thought I'd never get back up. But in Seattle, alongside people like Mia, Jay, Sarah, and Ethan, I learned that failure isn't the end. It's a beginning. Greenlink, the startup we built from a few $1,000s and a scribbled whiteboard, became proof that I could be someone beyond the Remington name. I found myself, not through my father's approval, but through sleepless nights, arguments with the team, and moments when I dared to believe in my dreams. Bryce, my brother, is learning that lesson too. He dared to file for divorce from Eleanor Caldwell, to defy our father and step out of the cage that once held me. Seeing him now, freelancing, joking in my apartment, I see a new Bryce. Not the spoiled younger brother, but a man finding his way. "Bryce," I told him one evening over coffee, "don't fear failure. Don't fear being called a traitor or unfilial. The worst fear is living a life that's not yours." He nodded, his eyes bright, and I knew that advice was as much for me as for him. The message I want to convey isn't about triumph or revenge. It's about courage. Courage to leave, to face pain, and to rebuild. My father, Douglas Remington, may call me an unfilial son, but I no longer need his approval. I've learned that family isn't expectations or chains, but the people who stand by you when you choose to live authentically. Bryce is my family now, and perhaps one day I'll find a way to reconnect with my mother. But with my father, I choose forgiveness, not by returning, but by letting him live with his choices as I live with mine. Standing on my balcony, looking out at Seattle glimmering in the rain, I think about the future. Greenlink may grow bigger, or it may face new challenges. Bryce may stumble, but I know he'll get up. As for me, I'll keep walking, unsure of the destination, but certain I'm on my own path. My father called me an unfilial son, but perhaps I'm just the first son who dared to live the way I wanted.